So after we engage with our stakeholders, collect all of the requirements, we're going to have a big list of everything we need to do to complete the project. Now what we need to do is we need to define our scope. We need to take it a step further and define exactly what work we're going to be doing and what we're going to be delivering to complete the project. The define scope process is about developing a detailed description of the project and its deliverables, and it expands on the high-level objectives we developed when we created the project charter, and also expands on all of the requirements we identified in the collect requirements phase. The goal is to create a precise project scope statement that defines the project work and the product we're going to be delivering. Through the define scope process, we're also going to be selecting the final project requirements. So during the previous process, we would have identified a ton of different requirements. Maybe we did some prioritization, but when we actually create our detailed scope statement, we're going to have to cut out some of these requirements. We're going to be left with a very precise definition of what is and is not included in the project scope. Okay, let's look at this process mapped out in terms of the inputs, the process, and the outputs. As our inputs, we've got our project charter, our project management plans, our project documents, and our enterprise and environmental factors, as always. Then we've got the process, which is defining the scope. The output is going to be the project scope statement and any updates to our document registers. So our assumption log, our requirements documentation, our requirements traceability matrix, and our stakeholder register. Now, as we go through these inputs, so the project charter, the high-level description of the objectives and any initial requirements and constraints. These would have also fed into our requirements documentation and the development of the requirements traceability matrix. Then we're also going to need to refer to our scope management plan and specifically refer to how we said we would define scope. So what we mean by this is we'd look at what documentation we would be developing to accurately define project scope. We also need to refer to our project document, so our assumption log, our requirements documentation specifically, and our risk register. If we've developed one at this stage, we'd also refer to our risk register and any potential risks that could impact project scope. And as always, we've got our enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Okay, in terms of the tools and techniques we're going to be using, so the first is going to be expert judgment. We're going to be engaging with individuals who worked on similar projects, who know what's involved and understand where scope issues arise. That's probably going to be the most important thing we get from expert individuals. They're going to know where projects during project execution run into issues defining scope and what sort of scope ambiguity problems tend to come up on these sorts of projects. We're also going to need to do some level of data analysis. So we're going to do our alternative analysis, specifically deciding what requirements to include in the project, but also how we're going to deliver the project work. We might have different delivery methodologies, and we want to choose between alternatives to come up with the optimal way of delivering the project. And we're also going to do our document analysis. So looking at all the documentation we developed during the collecting requirements phase and basically making sure everything's relevant to the project scope is included in the scope. Then we're also going to need to make some important decisions about what to include and not to include in the project scope. So we're going to also need to use some sort of multi-criteria decision-making process, so we're ensuring we're including the most high-value, important items in the project scope. We'll also need to use our interpersonal skills, so this will be where we've defined scope and we're showing it to our stakeholders, getting their feedback and making sure they're happy with how we've defined project scope. We're going to need to do some sort of product analysis. So to define scope properly, we're going to need to understand everything we need to do to complete the project. We want to understand the structure, the product we're completing, and basically just to understand the entirety of the work we're delivering and make sure all of it's captured in our project scope statement. We'll also be looking at our requirements to ensure they align with the project objectives and understanding any sort of systems or processes within the project to make sure we're capturing all of the work that needs to be done to complete the project. We can use different diagramming methods to help us to articulate and define scope. So we could use some sort of mind map to visually represent project scope, or a context diagram like I spoke about in the last video, where we could map out the way a system operates and use this to clearly explain visually how we've defined project scope. The key output of this process is going to be the project scope statement. So the project scope statement is the detailed description of the project deliverables and the work required to complete them. So it's got two elements to it. It's the deliverables, the finished product, and also the work we need to do to complete it. So it's very important that we define both of those. Going to include all of the deliverables, the acceptance criteria, so the conditions under which the deliverables will be accepted, any exclusions, so anything we're specifically not doing. That's where you really come into expert judgment and getting input from people who've worked on similar projects, because they'll help you to be able to identify typical exclusions or typical issues around scope that people run into on projects. So capturing these in an exclusion list is going to be incredibly important during project execution, and also any assumptions and constraints we've had to make to create our project scope statement. We're also going to need to update any other documents that may have changed during this process. So those would be our assumption log, any new assumptions we've identified as we've gone through the process of defining scope, any changes to the requirements documentation or the requirements traceability matrix. Maybe we've decided to exclude some requirements as we've gone through defined scopes. We just need to make sure we're also keeping these documents up to date. As an example, I want to show you a typical scope statement. So this is going to be for an imaginary 50 megawatt solar farm. And it's going to start off with the project description. So the project involves the development and construction of a 50 megawatt solar photovoltaic solar farm in a certain area. The aim of the project is to generate clean electricity, to connect to the grid, and also to contribute to the region's sustainability goals. And the solar farm will cover the solar panels, inverters, transformers, and any necessary infrastructure. After the high-level description of the project, we then define the scope of the product that the project's delivering. So the physical deliverable being created by the project, we've got the solar farm will include the following components: solar panels, installation of approximately 150,000, inverters, the transformers, the mounting structures, and any supporting electrical infrastructure. So that's the description of what's physically being delivered. Then we've got our requirements or deliverables. So what is physically going to be handed over in addition to the product? So we've got design documents. We're obviously going to need drawings and specifications that show us what to build, and then a series of drawings to hand over to the operations and maintenance team. We're also going to be needing to organize any permits and approvals. We're going to create a procurement plan. We're going to create a detailed construction plan. Then we're going to physically go out there, build the solar farm and complete the solar farm, and also test it, connect it to the grid, and generate a commissioning report. So we've defined the product we're going to be delivering and also any other deliverables we're going to be providing as part of the requirements. That captures the scope of what we're going to be doing. We now also need to talk about in what state these deliverables are going to be accepted. So we've defined here the acceptance criteria. So we've got performance. The solar farm must generate a minimum of 50 megawatts under standard test conditions. Quality. All installations must meet the relevant industry standards and regulatory requirements. Functionality. The solar farm must be fully integrated with the local grid and operate without any major issues. Documentation. The project sponsor and key stakeholders must submit, review, and approve the deliverables. And then commissioning. The solar farm must pass all the commissioning tests. So you can see here spelled out clearly what the project has to achieve for these deliverables to be accepted. Then, critically important, we've also defined our exclusions. So what's not covered under the scope of the project? Well, the first one is land acquisition. We're not including within our budget in the scope of our project buying the land for the solar farm. We're not going to do any grid upgrades. We're not allowing for any costs to improve the infrastructure the grid we connect to, and we're not including any maintenance in the scope of the project. So it's really important to define these exclusions. So if any issues come up during project execution, for example, the grid authority wants us to upgrade the grid to connect to the solar farm, we've got it here clearly in our scope statement that that's not part of the project scope. And then finally, we've got any important assumptions that impact scope. So things like weather conditions, supply chain, regulatory approvals, and funding. And ultimately, you can see going through this process of collecting the requirements, we've now turned these into a clearly articulated definition of the project scope. It's super clear what's in the project scope, what isn't, what we're proposing to do, and also what deliverables we're going to be handing over. Then how these deliverables are going to be accepted. We can show this to our stakeholders and everybody can be very happy with what's included in the project scope and what the end result we're delivering.